Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Uh, what hopes for the UK EU reset, which has been brought to you by the European Movement in Sussex and the UK Trade Policy Observatory at Sussex University. I'm Jonty Bloom. I was in past life BBC business correspondent. I did 2 terms in Brussels as well, reporting from there. I'm now a freelance journalist, speaker, and moderator of events like this. So you're all very welcome. Um, I think it is safe to say that Brexit has not been the unalloyed triumph that we were told it was going to be. Um, but for those who were thinking that new Labour or a new Labour government would mean a radical new relationship with the EU, have also been disappointed, I think. On a personal note, I've just been on holiday in France, which cost me £300 more than it would have done before Brexit, because my dog needs forms signed both before we leave the UK and before we come back to the UK. And when I say £300, I mean £250 of that goes to a British vet and £50 goes to the French vet. So if the reset could sort that one out, I'd be very, very happy. But that's just one part, a small illustration of a far larger issue, which is that Brexit has cost us significantly economically, and a reset was and is supposed to minimize those costs and improve the economic consequences of Brexit. But when the UK EU reset meeting was concluded, which was in May last year, it was described by Keir Starmer as being good for jobs, bills, and borders. But progress so far seems to be pretty mixed. On the positive side, we've got Erasmus Plus. That's been announced as starting in 2027. Sanitary and phytosanitary standards are, starting to happen. And we have emissions trading and the UK's participation in the electricity market, the EU electricity market. But thus far, participation in the Security Action for Europe hasn't happened. That's the €150 billion fund designed to improve defence procurement. That's just not happened. There's an argument over money. And for those hoping for a return to a seamless border, well, hope shines eternal. But with the government refusing to even discuss membership of the single market, the customs union, or allow free movement, it's not shining very brightly. But to try to cast more light on this, more than I could possibly manage, we have an expert panel for you. We have Professor Emily Lydgate, Professor of Environmental Law and co-director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory at the University of Sussex, who is joining us from Hawaii, of all places. We've got James MacCleary, MP for Lewis and party spokesman on defence and Europe, Helen Maguire MP, Lib Dem MP for Epsom and Ewell, and last but not least, David Henig, who's the UK director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, and associate fellow at the UK Trade Policy Observatory. And he was closely involved in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations, which have been one of Trump's victims, I suppose. The format is simple. I have an opening question for each member of the panel to allow them to set out their knowledge, thoughts, and opinions, and then I will follow up with some other questions, most of which we want to get from you. So please do send in your questions. Do not be shy. Otherwise, I have to think of more and more things to say, and it will not be as interesting for you or for anyone else. So I'm starting with Professor Lydgate, who's in Hawaii. And the question I set her was, why was a reset necessary? And what is it going to be like?
Good
Professor.
afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
So, I guess we should first clarify that I think reset kind of has two meanings. One is the narrower, sort of more technical meaning of the set of negotiations that are currently underway after the May 2025 summit. And I think we'll get into some of those details in our discussion. But I think there's also a broader meaning of essentially breaking away from the bitter Brexit divorce era and moving towards at least a friendship, shall we say? So was this necessary? I mean, it's not up to me, but I think considering that the Labour government essentially coined this term, they considered it necessary, and I think we could probably identify a few reasons for that. I'll name three. The first is the growing recognition of the need to embrace strategic interdependence. in a world of increasing global instability and unpredictability, including from some of the UK's traditional allies who will remain nameless. The second is the ways in which a reset dovetails with a growth agenda. So divergence for the sake of divergence is not part of where the political discourse is at anymore. We don't want, it doesn't seem like a good use of political capital. And do we need people paying for their pets to cross borders? What are the other kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of ways that we can help businesses, particularly small businesses, and help redress some of the regulatory and other types of obstacles that have arisen. And I think a final aspect of it, what's driving this is public opinion. So a lot of people think Brexit, or at least the way it played out, wasn't good for the country, and that creates a kind of a political opportunity for Labour to distance themselves from the Conservatives. Where this leads, I think we'll get into, but there are definitely some specific items on the agenda. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor. William Bain hasn't joined us quite yet, but so let's go to James MacCleary next. James, what are the political obstacles to a better reset? And how could they be overcome? Because I think a lot of people thought Labour was going to be much more proactive than this, but they seem to be very hidebound by public opinion and so on.
Good morning, just about good afternoon, everyone, depending on where in the world you are. So yeah, it's a good question, Jonty. I mean, it's been what we've been up against since 2024 when the new Labour government came into power. They had hamstrung themselves from the start because, of course, they put these red lines in place during the election campaign, which included no single market, no freedom of movement, no customs union, which was really hemmed them in terms of their sort of wriggle room politically. And from very early on, we were pushing quite hard. I said we, as in Liberal Democrats and others too, to get the government to go faster and be a bit more ambitious. We tried to push forward with a youth mobility scheme. We have ended up with, obviously not the same thing, but we have ended up with Erasmus Plus, which was good movement. But the reality is that the government's objectives and their glacial progress towards those objectives has been incredibly unambitious. They talk about it in the context of economics, but also in the context of security and defence. But from the economic perspective, really, they've barely moved the needle. The SPS agreement, which is apparently under negotiation, again, would be a very positive thing. My local farmers here in the Lewis area would be delighted to get an SPS agreement with Europe. But the truth is that if we want to move the needle and actually start to stimulate some economic growth through our relationship with Europe, then the truth is that we need to be a bit more ambitious than that. We have proposed to party a customs union with the European Union, which is at least a bit more ambitious and certainly would be a big step in the right direction and would benefit a lot of UK industry. But ultimately, it's my view that we have to find a way of getting access to the single market again. And if you want to generate real growth in the economy, that's where you're going to get it from. I think one thing I've said before, and I think a number of people have said, is that the government at some point are going to have to sort of stop sort of dancing on the head of a pin with this. The reality is that they're running out of ways to stimulate growth. We are in an incredibly challenging international economic situation. Just when the Chancellor thought she was going to be announcing energy prices coming down a bit, just when she thought that she was going to be able to give some good news, the Middle East descends into turmoil, and we've got an oil price shock, which is clearly going to oil and gas shock, which is clearly going to ripple through to energy prices very soon. The answer, in terms of a safe haven, is clearly to get closer and closer to our European friends. That doesn't come from a place of starry-eyed pro-Europeanism, although I'm a very pro-European person. It comes from a place of just sheer pragmatism. We've got to look for places where we've got partners we can rely on, but also look for things that can actually really make a difference to people's lives. And you made a reference to the difficulties we now have travelling to Europe in some cases, and some of the extra bureaucracy that comes with that. We've obviously seen the difficulty that in the labour market with employers getting access to what used to be very easy to get access to European labour markets and now is much harder. And obviously there is all the bureaucracy that comes from the increased red tape for trade and moving things around. In an interconnected modern economy, it is, of course, the last thing you want to do, make more friction between yourselves and your neighbours. So in short, I think we are, I've praised the government. I think the tone has been much better from day one. I did welcome that, and I've said that very publicly. But I have to say, I think the lack of ambition and the very slow progress is actually becoming very damaging now. And we are going to need to see some more ambition from them. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be forthcoming.
Excellent, thank you. Now, Helen, I think a lot of people thought that defence, especially given our relationship with Trump and America at the moment, was an open door. This new European Defence Fund, the Security Action for Europe Fund, if Britain could get in that, not only would that be a good thing in itself, but it would signal a lot of pro-European sentiment, and it just didn't seem to happen. Now, was that because Europe was asking for too much, or was it just a British failure, do you think?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, at the time at the moment when we've, unfortunately, there's just been the 4th anniversary of the Ukraine war. One might think that actually, making sure that we can all work together as European countries to actually access defence fund would be the right way forward, regardless of the fact that we left the European Union. But as you've mentioned, it doesn't seem to be the case. And I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there, is about the amount of money that was being asked. And it seemed as though there were a number of countries, including Germany and the Netherlands, who were very keen on us joining it. But there were other countries like France who were, really trying to push and get us to pay more money. And the amount that they were asking, which I'm led to believe is somewhere between 4.5 and 6.5 billion, was just astronomical. And I appreciate that we do have a big defence industry in the UK, so obviously it has to be kind of comparative to that. But when you compare it to, say, for example, Canada, who are paying 10 million initially, it's just, I mean, it's just the completely opposite ends of the spectrum. And we recognise, or everyone recognises, that we need the companies in the UK to be part of this. So it's incredibly disappointing that they haven't come to an agreement. And I really hope that at the next EU-UK summit in the spring that they'll be prioritising defence and safe, and hopefully that they will come to a reasonable agreement that this UK government can engage with. And I think, as you mentioned, if we can't even come to an agreement on something as important as defence at the moment, then how are we ever going to get to any other agreement? And I think it completely reiterates the point of how difficult it is going to be for us now, following Brexit, to actually come to agreements on other issues as well. So it's really disappointing that we are here at the moment, but let's keep our hopes high and see if we can make some progress at the next summit.
Excellent, thank you very much. And now, finally, David, I think this is a question a lot of people will be really interested in. What more could the UK realistically ask for from the EU? And could it get more from a proper, determined reset, do you think? What difference would it make to the economy?
Okay, well, I'm in Brussels today, so I split my time between Brussels and London. Hello to some fairly familiar names on those listening in. Apologies if some of you have heard this before, but it's getting pretty tough in the world of trade, and it's getting pretty tough in Brussels. The EU is getting more protectionist, and that is including towards neighbours. It's including towards the UK. Well, it's not just towards the UK. Some of you may have seen, for example, yesterday that EU leaders said no fast track for Ukrainian accession to the EU. So it's a tough place now to be looking for favours. So we're probably not going to get any. So that makes it tricky. We've got the current negotiations ongoing. They're running into the usual kind of things that happen in negotiations, where there's quite a few issues that just have to be worked through on SPS. The details have to be got right. You don't really want to hurry that and then find that you can't actually export seamlessly to the EU, as for example James's farmers would like to do. So that may take time. I think we're looking at 2027 for the start of implementation of SPS agreement, perhaps youth mobility. But I think that will be a process that we go through. And we're kind of running out of the approach then of what more could we get, kind of little bits of single market access. People would talk about things like the Pan-Euromed Convention on Rules of Origin or mutual recognition of conformity assessments. But the EU has been making clear that they don't want to see the UK cherry picking trade elements of the single market. That if you are going to do more, if you want more, then it has to be on the basis of four freedoms, and that includes movement of people. And I'm afraid, with regard to a customs union, that also makes the customs union far more difficult. It is very hard to imagine that the UK can have a customs union negotiated with the EU without that substantively covering also movement of people. In exactly what way, we wouldn't know. And so where this starts to take you is that you would, in order for the UK to substantively move on beyond the current negotiating agenda, it will need to make a much bigger leap, rub out some of those red lines, and start being prepared to talk about substantial financial contributions, movement of people, and more generally about being partners with Europe, about a vision in which the role of Brussels is not to provide fodder for the UK press, but to be constructive partners. Now, quite possibly that doesn't happen until Labour, the Dems, any other party has won an election on such a manifesto, in order for the EU to say, okay, we can see now that this is serious, this is a government's position, we will now negotiate that. So any ideas that we move towards a substantively different relationship, whether on the basis of customs union, single market, Swiss style, as some have said, yes, I think the EU could be open to it, but only on the basis this is substantially different, and probably that it has gone through a UK general election and been the winning position. So hope that's not too disappointing to some people, but I'm afraid that those are the realities we find here. We're running out of road for the current approach.
Yes, thank you very much, David. So we've already had several questions. Please send in more. This one was from Sarah Cowley, and I'd like Emily to answer it first, which is basically, as David was basically referencing, unless we tear down some of the red lines, we've got a real problem. And my issue with the red lines is they weren't really mentioned in the referendum. They were invented after the referendum. So why they're so imposed upon us and are unbreakable, I never quite understood. Could you kind of talk to that, Emily?
Yeah, so two points on that. I mean, the first one is that I would argue that in some respect, there has been a very quiet stepping away from the red lines on both sides, in the sense that Labour have showed some political courage in pursuing deep alignment, deep integration in some areas in SPS, and also with the energy market and the ETS system. So food and energy. And I think that's significant, but obviously very far from what a single market would really look like. But also on the EU side, I think that shows, because their red line was no cherry picking. That's clearly cherry picking. There's no way around it. So to me, the question is, well, where are the little pockets? Even if you have the red lines, where can we erase parts of them? And I think another aspect of this, which is interesting, is thinking about kind of the relationship between the technical and the political here. So when we left the EU, it was just incredibly complex because we had all these merged functions. We had all these bodies we were part of and worked on all these things together. And then we had to devolve those to the UK and figure out how our internal market was going to work and all this, develop all these new capabilities. We negotiated all these new trade agreements. So so there's another question about kind of how we would bring those things back. And I think that's what's being confronted right now in the SPS and in kind of the food realm and the energy realm is, well, how do you actually bring these things back together? And I think with something like a customs union or joining different rules of origin, that question would also arise. So we have this, for example, free trade agreement with, we joined the CPTPP. The EU isn't part of that. What does that mean for that? What does that mean for all of our other agreements, which are very slightly different? So it's the longer that we go on separate paths, the more things diverge, and that makes coming back together more complicated. And what that means, bringing back to political will, is that you need a strong political will to actually overcome those obstacles and to make the case. And I think that's where I'm not sure that we have that at the moment on either side.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to Helen and then James next, because I think that really does come to the politics of the matter, which is, I'm sure you and quite a few people watching this would just love it if the government turned around and said, we tried cherry picking, it doesn't work. We're just going to have to get rid of some of the red lines and admit it doesn't work. But there doesn't seem to be any sign of that happening yet, does there?
No, you're absolutely right, and I think the challenge is that this government is always obviously looking at the political wind, at one point in time that was very much on the right hand side with reform, and now with the recent by-election and the Greens win, that's on the left hand side as well. So rather, I think, than coming in with a clear vision of this is what we want to achieve in government, which is Erasmus Plus or whatever the clear objectives are, it just seems we're kind of swaying from one thing to another. And I think if there was a sort of a clear objective, then you could absolutely do that and say, right, what we'd said we would do is get rid of the red lines, and what we want to make sure is that we are part of these agreements, etc., etc. But when that hasn't been outlined from day one, then it's very difficult, and therefore what they do is they're unfortunately open themselves up to attack, whether that's from the left or the right. So it's a very tricky position for them, but obviously myself and James, we keep pressing them on this matter at every single opportunity, and there is no end of examples of people who are incredibly frustrated, whether it's local businesses or whether it's people like yourself who are having to pay for moving your pets when you're going on holiday, or whether it's standing in a massive queue going on holiday or whatever it is. So yes, there's every reason to try to make this work better.
James, one of the questions which we've been sent in actually relates to this, and it is, does the fact that Mandelson has left Washington under a shadow that McSweeney has left, that these were the people who were basically telling Labour, well, we can just go for trade deals, we can get closer to America, that'll work. And that patently hasn't worked, and it's actually going in reverse, really, at the moment, isn't it? And the natural consequence of that is you might say, well, the only other thing left is to get back closer to Europe again.
Yeah, I mean, it's been the argument for quite a while now. The point around just the point around cherry picking, I find quite interesting. There's sometimes we can be a bit absolutist, and I often find people sort of giving the sort of the Brussels view of what or the European Commission's view of what cherry picking is. I do sort of slightly push back, and I don't want to sound like I'm being a British exceptionalist here, but I do think the UK is exceptional when you talk about a third country for the European Union. We are a huge economy. We have an enormous defence industrial complex in this country. We're the biggest defence sector in Europe by far, and actually I do think there are cases for Britain to be treated exceptionally by the European Union. I don't actually think we are the same as some of the smaller countries that they deal with, and I don't mean that from a place of arrogance, but it comes from a place of just hard-nosed realism. This is the truth of it. And when we talk about defence in particular, as Helen's already touched on, the idea that Europe pushes on with defence rearmament and integration without tightly including the UK is absurd, quite frankly. And they really need to think again about about what they're doing with Safe. It isn't cherry picking to just let us into that at a reasonable price. But I think we do have quite a lot of issues around these red lines and Labour not moving. I think the removal of some of those individuals you mentioned may well help. I think the fundamental problem is that Labour have dug themselves into quite a deep hole here. A lot of Labour MPs are very, very pro-European. In fact, sometimes they make me sort of go, wow, okay, that's a bit further than I go, guys. So they really are very strong on this, a lot of them, and there's huge frustration within the Labour Parliamentary Party that they've not gone further. And I think one of the things we're looking at is a Prime Minister who's not in a very secure place right now, and we've got the local elections coming, which are likely to be extremely bad for Labour, and there'll be definitely a strong case from some others who may well be positioning themselves for leadership of the Labour Party to be much closer with Europe and maybe even start to flex those red lines a bit more. So I think you're right, and I think we may well start to see some movement in the coming months, particularly as the Chancellor runs out of other roads to go down to try and get that economic growth, which she quite rightly is so focused on.
Yes, that's a very good point, and not least because you kind of all the analysis, including from Sussex University, tells us what the economic damage is and how much it's affecting productivity and growth. And then the Chancellor's sitting there going, well, how am I going to increase growth? And you're going to go, well, there's an elephant in the room, isn't there? And so, David, the next question is also one that's been sent in, but I was going to ask something about it anyway. Is this story in the FT about the Made in Europe criteria for the EU and how it's going to affect car making in the UK? Can you just talk us through that? Because it seems to be a classic case of the kind of damage that, we didn't see coming. I mean, all those people at the Nissan factory in Sunderland cheered when they voted, when Brexit happened, and now it doesn't look like quite such a clever idea, does it?
Well, UK manufacturing has always been vulnerable after Brexit. That is just a fact. And as the EU is looking to put up more barriers to potentially say that public procurement of vehicles might depend on how much of them is made within the EU, that potentially affects the UK. Now, exactly how these details work through in terms of made in Europe, we don't know exactly. But I would make a couple of broader points on this. The last time the UK had an EU expert in number 10 working on these issues day in, day out, I think was 2019. I don't think that person has ever been replaced. And yet there's a huge amount coming down the track. We are about to align all our food and drink regulations, all our regulations regarding carbon pricing, with the EU. Very little is being done to set us up for that. Made in Europe has been coming down the track for some time. Peter Kyle, the Secretary of State for Business, was in Brussels last week, but he was in Brussels making what sounded like special pleading, and it wasn't really building on the kind of regular ongoing public dialogue in Brussels that you would need in order to make a noise here. I'm struggling to think of the last time UK MPs came to Brussels and made speeches to say, look, the UK is part of Europe. It's all very well saying that in London, but frankly, the UK barely plays in Brussels right now. We need a lot more noise from the whole UK political system if we want to do that. That is partly the government's fault, no question of doubt about it. They obviously had to build things up from a very low base, but equally the UK political system is not helping here. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And while that doesn't happen, then you are going to get more of these kinds of made in Europe stories that Nissan says, if it doesn't go a certain way, we may be affected. There will be other companies in the same boat, because quite simply, we're not playing into the conversation and we're not bringing anything onto the table. And I think there's a difference, for example, with regard to SAFE. Now, EU figures will actually admit that what happened with SAFE funding, the EU ask of the UK, was actually a mistake, and they would like to try to find ways to actually make up for that. They're not saying the same on the trade side, where they see the UK as kind of overprivileged and kind of always asking for things and not prepared to put anything onto the table itself. So, I just think that we just need a whole lot more effort if we're going to turn this around. And it's not just about the government of the day. It is about the whole of UK politics. It's about the whole emphasis to which the UK system gives to the EU. It doesn't nearly give enough to the EU as compared to, say, the US. These are major issues that need to be tackled. So if you want to say what next for the reset, it needs an awful lot more resource to be put towards EU relations before a lot of this will happen.
Excellent. I'll come to Emily next, and then Helen and James, because this reminds me of when I was in Brussels, and you would meet the people from UKREP, and which was our embassy to the EU. And they were, at that time, they were trying to hothouse civil servants and make them do language courses and teach them about the EU, because even then, we just did not have enough people who knew anything about Brussels. I mean, working at the BBC was frustrating enough because they just thought it was boring. And since then, things must have got worse, Emily, haven't they? I mean, do we have the expertise in the Foreign Office or the Department of Trade or whatever to deal with this?
I mean, we were at a pretty low baseline. I mean, I guess it's probably improved a little bit. I'd be interested in probably others on the call would have more insight on this than I do. But I wanted to say something about kind of the flip side of that as well, which is, so we've been talking about the UK political capital and other types of capital dedicated to cultivating the EU relationship. But the flip side of that is also managing the UK public and its perceptions, because that has been the taskmaster, the democratic will of the people. So, and voting for Brexit. So I think another aspect of this, which I would argue that the Labour government is overlooking, is the need to reframe the idea of sovereignty. That you can actually make a sovereign decision to align with or a democratic decision even to align more closely with the EU. So if you look at, for example, Switzerland, which aligns very closely with the EU in a large number of areas, they are also known to be a direct democracy that is very, very powerful, and those things can coexist. And I think in the Labour government, there hasn't been much attention given to, for example, if we're going to have an SPS agreement, how are we going to decide to pass that treaty? Will there be some sort of parliamentary process behind that? How will the devolved nations be involved in that? How will stakeholders be involved? It feels very much like a black box. We don't really know what's going on. And I think that political instinct to just push it across the line and not kind of make it more transparent and consultative could be a mistake, because it reinforces the perception that this is just kind of a rule-taking process and nobody has any say. So I would say that creating more of a sense of public accountability for our relationship with the EU would be something that would help to future-proof deeper alignment.
Thank you, Helen. Well, that brings, that means I have two questions for you. One is, do we just lack the expertise? And the other is, why is the government being so reticent about putting its head over the barricade and saying that this is a benefit and we should be willing to pay for this, and those kind of issues? Because the polls, I mean, Carol Tong has sent a question in, which is basically, if 60% of the people think we should rejoin the EU, why is the government being so cold-footed about this? What's going on?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. On the expertise point, I mean, I totally agree. When I've had various meetings with the FCDO, I just feel at the moment that they're quite hollowed out in terms of expertise. And I've been had a number of meetings when French delegations have come over and others, and it's been really surprising that the size of the teams nowadays from what they used to be. And I think what's compounded that also is the reduction in international international development aid. And so there's just been an all-round kind of reduction, and that will have long-term consequences ultimately, because expertise isn't built up overnight. It's passed on and people train others, and so that's incredibly disappointing. But on the reticence, I mean, James and myself kind of both alluded to this, and the only thing that I can think of is it's to do kind of with polling and where the Prime Minister is at the moment and the weakness and the position that he's in and the fact that, they are likely to do very badly in the elections in May. So he probably doesn't feel emboldened to make those really bold decisions. And the time to have made those bold decisions would have been when he first came in. And he should have set the agenda and said, right, this is what I'm going to do. These are the decisions I'm going to make. And, we'll have some discussions with the EU about X, Y, and Z. That didn't happen. So he's now found himself in a place where he's much weakened, where it's much harder to make those decisions unless circumstance dictates that you need to, because, for example, there's a war in Ukraine, therefore you need to be part of a defence fund, etc. So it'll be interesting to see how it progresses. And it might be that what we've seen, for example, with Erasmus Plus is that things sort of slip out and things slowly progress, even though they're not necessarily big announcements. Now, I hope that will kind of continue and we will continue to get a few more agreements. But I don't think at the moment he feels as though he's got the power and the behind him to actually make those bigger decisions that we all feel will kind of help grow our economy and benefit businesses and residents.
James, that's a very good point, Helen, because if Labour had come in, I remember Gordon Brown coming into when Blair won and declaring independence for the Bank of England, and we all went, "Where was that in the manifesto?" I don't. And then you looked at like page 24, and there was a vague reference to it, and he just said, "No, we've got a mandate. That's it." If Starmer had come in and said, "Oh yeah, well this is obviously we've got a huge majority. This is obviously a mandate for changing some red lines or having proper discussions," then he could have got away with it. But as Helen points out, he's losing influence, and that's making things more difficult, isn't it?
So, they explicitly, the problem is they explicitly ruled it out. It wasn't the sort of, they didn't leave themselves any wriggle room at all. They had these very clear red lines. And actually what they've done as well, which has really not helped them, when I was doing the Europe spokesperson job, we talked a lot about youth mobility, and continually the government would conflate on purpose youth mobility with freedom of movement, which is, I'm sure pretty much everybody in this virtual room knows is not the same thing at all. And so what they did, actually, they made the red lines even thicker because they started tacking other stuff onto their red lines at the beginning. And at the beginning, that was linked to the fact that they are trapped by the sheer diversity of their seats. They have seats that are in London, which are very, very diverse seats, which would be very liberal places with very progressive attitudes and are extremely pro-European, as is most of London. And they have seats in the northeast of England and the Midlands, which voted heavily to leave the European Union and are some of the most sceptical seats that you will find on Europe. And they have to balance both these things together. And so what they've ended up with is they've sort of trapped themselves in this position where they sort of don't feel like they can say anything pro-European because they're worried about losing those seats. May make a difference to that. I mean, if they get completely wiped out across all of those seats in the local elections, which in many cases seems to be highly likely, hearing some horror stories from some of the northern cities from a Labour perspective in terms of how they're performing at a local level, then it may be that the Prime Minister says, actually, you know what, we'll lose these seats anyway. Let's actually do the thing that's good for the country, which I suspect he probably knows is a much closer alignment and probably some sort of much more broad trade and defence deal with the European Union. I mean, but also Helen's alluded and I think, everybody has, to the fact that we do have to remember there's another side to this discussion. Although, if we can put a deal on the table, the European Union may well be interested in it. We have to remember the member countries are also very different from one another. The safe negotiation has been a perfect example where the Germans were extremely keen for us to be in and the French were about as intransigent as French can be. And we know what that's like, and we've done it a lot of times as a country. So I think we have to remember that too. But yeah, they're in a muddle, the Labour Party. They've dug themselves into a really big hole, and we're a bit beholden to it. The final thing I say very quickly, Jonty, is about the next election. So now, as much as it sends a shudder down my spine, because I feel like the last general election was 5 minutes ago, we are already about halfway through this Parliament. And the next election, the parties will be asked to lay out their views on this. We may be looking at some sort of coalition government next time. And so there will be wriggle room there for other parties to start to say, you know what, if we want a government, we want the following things to happen with Europe. And that can be in their manifestos too. And I think Labour are already thinking about that, to be honest with you.
Well, I'm glad to hear the thinking about it because I'm going to ask both you and Helen about that a bit later on because I think the politics is quite interesting in that regard. But David, I'm just going to come to you first. We had a question which is basically about the difference between the customs union and the single market, and should we be actually be aiming for the single market rather than the customs union? But that also leads on to something that James just mentioned, which is lots of countries in Europe don't want us in there if we're getting a better deal than they're getting. We're not going to pay in enough. I mean, the Swiss have just agreed to pay, what was it, 50 million pounds a year just for access to the single market. And we'd have to do something like that, wouldn't we?
Yes. Look, there's a lot of different issues, and it can get quite complex about it. I think from a simple trade point of view, the substantive barriers are around the single market rather than customs procedures. So you get far greater economic benefit if the UK reintegrates into the single market as compared to a customs union. In either respect, we're in the situation now where that means we're going to be giving things up. We're going to be giving up some control over regulation. But if we get close to the single market, we're going to be giving up some control over trade policy in the event of a customs union. And any which way, there will be financial contributions. There will be discussions about movement of people, and so. In a sense, that's the conversation we're inevitably going to be having now. And actually, I think the conversation is moving on in the UK towards recognising this. I think it's taken a while. In some ways, I think that this government had to go through the stage of having a fairly shallow reset in order to just start rebuilding the trust in Brussels. You've just got to remember how bad things were here. And I was having to give reassurances back in 2024 to say, look, no, the Labour government, I did not think would negotiate in such an appalling manner as the previous one had done. But people were deeply scarred by it. I don't think we understand that enough in the UK as the level of scarring that was there. So there's just a lot to kind of to get our teeth into. And so when it comes to sort of how do you move forward, it's not entirely straightforward. There are a number of sort of different stories. I give the best impression I can of what I pick up from the kind of what might be called the Brussels bubble. I sometimes call the Brussels consensus making machine. It's where lots of people come together, drink coffees, gossip with each other, and ultimately some kind of positions are formed. But what I will say overall is that yes, there are different views towards the UK. There is a lot of suspicion. On the other hand, it's also up to people from the UK to start making their pitches about what could make a difference for relations, but also look at it from an EU point of view. I mean, again, too much of the conversation is in the UK. It talks about UK economic benefits. What's the benefit here for the whole of Europe? How do we express that? How do we keep talking about that as well? How do we make it a genuine two-way conversation? Because there's also not a huge number of people in Brussels who are really focusing on matters to do with the UK, and that's not helpful either. So I think there's just an awful lot to sort of unpack and to do, and I wouldn't underestimate that at all.
Emily, that brings us on to that kind of issue of I was kind of thinking, if we just changed our red lines, if we just did started to be reasonable and everything, the EU would have us back. And yet, a lot of people in the EU kind of obviously think, why would we risk that? Because another general election could result in them leaving again. That we've burnt an awful lot of bridges and boats in Brexit, and that does make it more difficult for us to negotiate and come back to them seriously, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would underscore what David says in that respect. In terms of the past, there's scarring, and I think that makes the prospect of the future rupture seem all the more vivid. But I do think that there are some what would you call them? Some pull factors, some push factors, some pull factors from the EU side as well that we shouldn't overlook. I mean, the UK is a significant economy with high defense capabilities. There's a strong sense of strategic vulnerability in Europe. At the same time, there is a lot of very complex and competing internal political agendas, as there always are in the EU between different member states. So it's a very, very complex terrain. It's, I think, multifaceted, and it would be too simplistic to say that they're fed up with us. I think they also know that in certain respects, they can certainly benefit from closer relations.
Yes, thank you very much. Helen, I'm going to come on to you now with actually that question that James kind of raised about the next election. That when you look at the by-election results, you kind of, it is possible to be really depressed about, the rise of reform and so on, but also the votes for Lib Dems and Greens and Labour seem to suggest that there's actually a Liberal majority if only you can get your hands on it. And do you think that the prospects for some kind of deal ahead of the next election or a coalition government after it means that Europe is going to, actually the tone is going to change on how we discuss it? Because at the moment it's just Farage doesn't like it, that's it. You're kind of feeling about the politics at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, what you can say is obviously that the political landscape has completely changed since the last general election. And, you're right to ask, how does that alter the question of, the kind of majority approach to the EU question? Obviously, I don't know what will happen at the end of the next general election, but we do have, as mentioned, the majority of people in the UK can see that having a closer relationship with Europe would be incredibly helpful. So, as a result of that, I think, as James mentioned, in everyone's manifesto, I mean, we're very clear as Liberal Democrats, so we want to have a closer relationship with Europe, but it will certainly be for Labour to have a firm think about that, because if they are likely to find themselves in a position where they will, lose the next general election, for example, or need to work with other parties or whatever, then these will be issues that will clearly need to be negotiated. And so it's, and what we're seeing as well, which is really interesting, is that, whilst we do talk about the rise of reform at the moment, there is also very much an anti-reform vote as well. Like at the last general election, we saw an anti-Tory vote. And it would be interesting to see, and I don't have the analysis on this, but I'm sure someone has done some polling somewhere to see whether part of the anti-reform vote is also links with the Remain vote, or the want to have a closer relationship to Europe. And if it does, then that again puts on the table the issue about, making sure that, those parties who are, not reform are clearly thinking about this, because we know the huge benefits that it could bring.
Thank you. And James, the one party we haven't mentioned actually are the people who did all this in the first place, which is the Tory party, which don't seem to actually be have much influence at the moment, even though they are the opposition.
Conservatives basically just abandoned the field, their position on leaving the European Union, then their subsequent catastrophic childish behaviour towards the negotiations. Effectively means they've given away their voice. They have no voice. If you want a very anti-European voice, you go to Reform. If you want to talk more reasonably about it, you go to other parties. I mean, the reality is that the Conservatives, on not just on that issue, it is not unusual for the Conservatives to be forgotten about in the discussion, because the world has changed. I mean, Helen's made the point very well. I mean, the landscape has changed. The by-election in Manchester just now was a really good example of that, where you had the Green Party winning that, and then obviously we've had Plaid won the by-election in Caerphilly. There's a lot of movement now in the political landscape. Your point about there being some sort of liberal progressive majority in this country is probably true, but it does split all over the place between different parties. And the other thing I'd say about Europe as a political issue is, in the real world, it's not most people's top issue. In fact, it's very few people's top issue. I mean, we're in local election campaigning mode at the moment, of being good Lib Dems. We're out this evening knocking on doors, and I've been doing lots of that, and we'll be sticking lots of leaflets through doors. I don't think a single person's mentioned Europe as their main issue to me canvassing. So that does impact on, to David's point, if you're going to go come up with some bigger deal, you need to make it your big priority, because it's a huge job we're talking about here. You've got to be very present. You've got to get a whole team in place to do it and push it in Brussels and in London. And the reality is that it just isn't that high up the agenda for most people. And so we end up with this slightly half-hearted approach. And the final thing to say on it, there is the Farage effect for Brussels. There is the fact that they're saying, yeah, but what if he wins the next election? You know, you might come over here with all these warm words and say all the right things, but he can just unwind the whole thing if he ends up as prime minister. So is it really worth us putting that much effort into it? And I do understand that concern, because the polls certainly do suggest at the moment that unfortunately Farage's party could do very well next time.
David, you're in Brussels at the moment. Is there do you get that feeling that they're basically saying, well, you know, when you've made your mind up, please do get in touch, but otherwise, you know, we're just going to, you know, sit this one out.
I get different accounts of this, because some people talking to EU folks say they're always being asked about Farage. I can't say it's ever come up in my conversations. So I'm not entirely sure, and I do think that there is an element of unfairness in that, because you know we could be saying, well, what happens when Bardella gets elected in France, if that happens? So clearly, you have a situation where you have populist right parties largely against trade and in favour of kind of national protections across the piece in different countries. And you have to work around that. I just think, though, that in terms of the bigger picture, it does play to the fact that it's likely to play into what is the post 2029 agenda with whatever the next UK government is, whatever the next European Commission is probably the big picture we're talking about. You may be able to do some smaller bits on top of the common understanding between all the current agreements being completed and the 29 election. Realistically, we're talking about that potential moment. And yeah, it's understandable that people are asking. That's just the nature of current international politics. People are asking what happens when X gets elected, or what happens after Trump becomes president. There's just a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of mistrust. We're having to deal with that anyway in all of our trade relations, whether it's with the US, with the EU, with others. So I think it's just factored in. We just have to kind of run with it, and it doesn't basically change the point, which is, you know, is the next election a point at which several parties are going to go with a really much more ambitious, this is what we would do, this is what we would try to negotiate in the next government, because and I think that's the question that's coming.
Thank you very much, David. So we're nearly out of time, so I'm just going to go around and ask for just a quick comment from you all, starting with Emily, which is, could we see real change before the next election if Labour suddenly pivoted and just went, we need to be pro-European, we need to talk about the benefits of this, we need to admit we're going to have to pay into to make use of certain EU schemes and so on, and just actually admit that reality has changed and Brexit didn't work? Could it make a real difference in 2 years?
I mean, I think the Labour government could do a lot with the current numbers. I mean, it seems to me that Labour has a very clear line in the sand that they've drawn to measure their success, which is growth. And so I think James's point is really important about sort of where EU reset lies in the public's imagination and business imagination and Labour government's imagination in terms of that growth imperative. And I think my perception is that businesses have, right after Brexit, complained a lot about how that complicated things, but now are more moving on to the more fundamentals, like the cost of energy, the difficulty of the planning system, the high cost of labor, et cetera. So the economic woes that the Labour government are experiencing are going to be the lens through which they see the importance of the reset primarily. And so I think the question is, to what extent do they see working with the EU as something that's going to bump up the numbers for them? And if they decide that's the way to do it, then I think they could do quite a lot.
Thank you very much, Emily. Now, Helen, it's pretty much the same question, but I suppose it comes down to what Emily said: is, you know, how much benefit does the government think it will get if it reopened what has been a can of worms for 10 years and says, no, we need this for growth?
Well, I think you're absolutely, I mean, that's the right question, but I think unfortunately the lens through which Labour are seeing this, as James kind of alluded to, is what their MPs are hearing on the doorstep. And because it's not the number one issue for the majority of voters who quite frankly are more concerned about potholes, the cost of living, their ability for their kids to actually be able to afford to pay for a flat, or put a deposit down on the first house, is so much higher up on the agenda, the NHS, that I just don't see it being a priority. And the only caveat to that would be the defence piece, which I know obviously MOD is pushing heavily. So I wish, and I really hope that it would be something that they would do in the next couple of years. But for all the reasons that I've outlined, because I just don't think they see it as a voter priority at the moment, I don't think we're going to see much progress there.
Thank you, James. I suppose you agree that it's the government doesn't see that it should spend much political capital on this if there aren't that many votes in it.
I think the government has chosen to frame it in a certain way. I think Emily's point is well made, that the Europe issue, if you like, it doesn't come on doorsteps as in you very rarely get somebody who says the main thing you should, although I did have a guy the other day says to me, but the main thing you should be focusing on is joining the European Union. But as Emily listed out there and Helen's just listed out, all of those issues, the individual issues that do come up, cost of living, immigration, they actually are all connected to the European Union issue, and the government has made in one breath, they've framed the growth argument as being, we have to get growth so that we can, and it will ripple through and make all these other things easier, investment in the NHS, reforming education, all of these things, which is true. The same argument can be made for our relationship with the European Union. If you were to get a new trade deal, you could stimulate growth, you could start to address a lot of the issues that are actually very high up people's agenda, but they've chosen not to frame it in that way. I honestly don't think that the current Prime Minister is going to move dramatically on that. If we have a different Prime Minister in this Parliament, that may be a different story. I don't know. And certainly looking at the next election, I think we could be looking at a very different conversation for the main parties going into that election.
Thank you very much, James. And David, finally, I mean, we've seen lots of calculations of what the cost of Brexit has been, anything from 4 to about 8% of GDP. I mean, it would be easy to make an argument that, there's another 4 or 5% of growth out there if only we did this properly.
There is growth out there from closer relations with the EU. It has to be borne in mind that whenever trade economists talk about growth as a result of greater trade, that is a long-run forecast over a number of years. So you don't get 4% straight away. There's a second point to that, which is you need it to be based on stability. People are not going to invest in the UK for exporting purposes to the EU if you don't actually know what the relationship is going to be. So that's where the potential for reform or Conservatives say, actually, we're not going to do any of that. It depresses investment. So, be a bit cautious. There is a set of policies around getting closer to the EU, focusing on growth that should have a growth premium if you go into it wholeheartedly and if you tell the story to voters, and also to the EU about what you're doing. Like I say, I think it's a bit late for this Parliament to lean into that big story, but that can start to address the fact that it's not coming up on the doorstep. Because if you tell that story that actually there's a bunch of things you can achieve by doing this, but equally you may be opening up fears or emotions that came to the fore in 2018, 2019 when UK politics appeared completely traumatized by the whole EU issue. So I think that's where we are. Yes, there's a growth potential there. There are lots of factors around it, but if somebody wants to lean into it, I think there's a story that could be told.
Thank you very much, David, who's in Brussels. Thank you for those final comments. I'm sure we all agree with that. Thank you to Emily Lydgate, Professor Lydgate, who's in Hawaii, and to our MPs, James MacCleary and Helen Maguire. Thank you all very much. Thank you for listening and for sending in your questions, many of which we did use. I didn't have to make up any of my own. So for that, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And a very good afternoon to you all.